Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of our weekly Exploring the Parasha class with Rabbi Rebecca Schatz and Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
Hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Schatz and Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
Hello.
And we are basically re-recording
Why are we re-recording, Rabbi Schatz?
our last Parasha class for Vezot Habrakha. And the reason we are re-recording is because this past week when we did the class hybrid, we were not able to record it in such a way that you could hear the teaching and all the students. So it was really nice to have people in person.
Okay, Rabbi Schatz is not giving the fun version of this story. The fun version of this story is slightly longer but worth the journey. Here's what happened. We wanted to give some of our students the ability to show up in person for the last class, which we did. To do a siyum, to wrap things up, which we had and was lovely. In order to make that happen, we met on the roof of the Pressman Academy building. Now, we also wanted to be able to live stream it to our faithful students who were not able to join it in person.
Zoom it, he means.
And so we, therefore, because it was Zoom, we were trying to use a
Zoom bot.
A Zoom bot. That's right. There was, however, one problem with the Zoom bot, which is not what you might be picturing, which is like a robot that uses Zoom. It's literally just a screen with a teeny tiny CPU. It was not as exciting as I thought it might be. There was only one problem with the Zoom bot, is that it did not have Zoom properly installed, really just making it a bot.
Correct.
So Rabbi Schatz, as I was getting the class underway, both on her phone and with our students in person, Rabbi Schatz spent approximately, this is not an exaggeration, 13 or 14 minutes trying to get the Zoom bot to work.
And then
she did not. This is the first time over the course of the whole pandemic that Rabbi Rebecca Schatz was not able to make
Zoom work.
True. And she said, you know what, this isn't going to work. We're going to do it over the phone and with our students here in person. And she hunkered down to teach with me, which takes a lot of effort to be able to try to rein me in, as we all know. And about 30 seconds later, what happened?
The fire alarm went off.
The fire alarm went off at the Academy, therefore making it very difficult to continue with our class. We evacuated the roof. We went back upstairs, and that's all before we even factor in the fact that the sound quality was terrible because we were on the roof and trying to all talk together. That recording does exist, and like many great works of art, will be hidden for generations, never to be discovered. Mm-hmm. So since we don't have that, we are offering up this not quite as entertaining, but mildly more coherent podcast as we look to conclude the reading of the Torah with Parshat
Vezot Habrakha. Okay, so we are looking at chapter 34, the last three verses of the entire Torah. So verses 10 through 12. And because we don't have our whole class here right now, we will go through the verses and then maybe we'll try to think of some of the kushiyot that the students thought of.
Can I make a noise like a fire alarm halfway through?
No. Okay. And then we'll go into some commentaries and we will wrap up the Torah with hopefully some
the Torah.
Oh, very good. Yeah.
Wrap up because the Torah gets wrapped.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Rabbi
with
Shapiro,
with a W.
Do you want to show
not an R?
Share, the verses. Show them. Thank you. Rabbi Shapiro is now showing you the verses. Okay.
Okay. Verse 10. V'lo kam navi od b'Yisrael kemoshe. Never again did there arise a prophet like Moses in Israel. Asher yida'o Adonai, who God, says here in the translation, who God singled out, but yada is know, who God knew. Intimately knew. Panim el panim, face to face. Lechol ha'otot v'hamoftim, according to all the signs and wonders, asher shalacho Adonai la'asot be'eretz Mitzrayim, doing all the signs and wonders that God sent him to do in the land of Egypt, leFaro, lechol abadav, lechol artzot Pharaoh, and to all of Pharaoh's servants, which interesting to note that at that time the Jews were also Pharaoh's Avadim, but probably not what that's referring to. Pharaoh's courtiers, as it's translated here, and all of his land. And the last verse of the Torah, Ulechol hayad chazaka, lechol hamorah hagadol, and for all of the strong hand and the, it says here awesome power, but morah, like related to yirah, like fear and awe, so all of that great fear and awe. Asher asa Moshe le'enei kol Yisrael. Chazak, chazak.
Chazak, chazak, v'ni chazek.
There you go. Chazak, chazak, v'ni chazek. Very good. That Moses did before the eyes of all of Israel. Shabbat shalom.
So, again, we're not going to go over Kushiot, but some of the questions that were asked throughout the class, though as Rabbi Shapiro just mentioned, I wasn't paying as much attention at this point of the class. I was trying to understand why a Zoom bot might not have Zoom.
Just a bot.
But some of the questions that came up were things such as, like, what does it mean for there never to have been, again, a prophet like Moshe, right? What does it mean that Moshe was really the only one? What does that say about all the other prophets that come later in Nevi'im, for example? And how were they different? Was it truly that, intimate knowing that Yad-o Adonai Panim al Panim that was different? For those of us who read further into Nevi'im, we obviously do know that is partially what was different. The Nevi'im that we read about in Tanakh did not have that face-to-face interaction with God. God became more of how we experience God today, which is not the anthropomorphized being, but rather a spirit, something that we pray to, a feeling, an encounter, those kinds of experiences for most of our prophets in Nevi'im. So that was one kushia. I don't know if you remember other kushia. That was a big one. That was asked.
That was a big one. There was a lot of. Well, there was a question: is the lokam navi, like? Is it that there will not or there had not yet? Right. There were comments about like how does the Torah know if it's being written when it was written? How does the Torah know 3,000 years ago that there will not be a prophet like Moshe? So there was some conversation about that, and a lot of conversation about panim al panim. We heard that Moses couldn't see God face to face, and here it is that he saw God face to face. So how literally or metaphorically should we take that? And most of the kushia were on that first verse, which is fun because I found most of my stuff on the last verse, so it's always interesting. Rebecca had not Rabbi Schatz. Rebecca had made the point that in verse 11, when it's talking about Pharaoh in Egypt, it seems to be framed in the more positive, but then like the strength and the fear in verse 12 for the Israelites are more not negative, a little less hooray, signs and wonders, and a little more strength and fear. And so she thought that was interesting. You might think it would be inverted. And there was also a lot of wind and Zoom spotting and fire alarms happening. So I think
one question that I don't think was asked, though if it was and you are listening to this podcast after also being in the class with us, please correct me if I'm wrong. But
why would somebody do that?
But it is interesting. Well, this is basically a different class.
That's true.
So it is interesting that in the last verse it says Ulechol hayad hachazaka, ulechol hamorah hagadol. That those are the two things, right? The yad hachazaka, which, as we know, very much comes out in kind of the physicality of God and the physical efforts or activities even that God did with and for the people, like the splitting of the Red Sea, for example. And then hamorah hagadol is much more kind of how we experience God now, right? It's interesting that so much of it is, if we were going to split the Torah, it's interesting that Hayad HaChazakah seems to be a little bit more like the Genesis Exodus God, and then Morah HaGadol seems to be kind of Leviticus through Deuteronomy in terms of like the Yirah factor, right? Like there's no God walking amongst us, but rather something that we...
Can we host a game show called the Yirah Factor?
Sure. Something that we fear or that we revere more so as just a an all-known being, and not a character living in our lives.
It's interesting that you divide them up that way. I saw in a couple of commentaries, it seems like, I didn't see where the exact genesis of this thought is, but like the Torah Haruch made this comment, and a couple of other commentators did as well, that the Yad HaChazakah refers to the red, like the splitting of the sea, and the Morah Gadol refers to what happened at Sinai.
Right.
Which
they're both
also,
Exodus,
both Exodus, but also makes sense in terms of understanding, right? Like,
so maybe that's the split. Right, like maybe one is kind of the people interacting with God before they were really a people, and then one's the element of like communal gather, like the thing that you would come together around, which is the Torah. That becomes when that changes for us. Yeah, well, and also Yad HaChazakah is something more, right? Splitting of the sea is a very tangible, physical thing. Mm-hmm. Depending on how you understand it, giving of Torah, tablets, voices, silence, whatever whatever you like. But it is not as physical as actually, splitting a fairly large body of water. Right. Correct. Yes. The one piece I remember offering in response to the prophecy piece, mm-hmm. and the idea of Moses, like there never again being a prophet like Moses for Israel, mm-hmm. is a couple of commentators also talk about how actually Bilam, who we saw a book and a half ago, was a prophet on the level of Moshe, and people talk about sort of what differentiates them. And the Kedushat Levi talks about how, let's read it. He says the greatest difference. Sorry for the visual learners. Even though I'm showing you the pages, I can show you Rabbi Schatz. Thank you.
You can. Do you want to read over my shoulder?
No, I'll listen.
Are we good?
Yeah.
Okay. He says the greatest difference between them, visible to all, is that Moses, during all of his life, employed his gift of prophecy beneficially at all times. Mm. He put his own life at risk on behalf of his people when trying to save them from God's justifiable anger at them. Bilam used his gift in exactly the opposite manner, as his accomplishments were achieved by invoking curses. He goes on more, but basically the big differentiation that Bilam, even though he is gifted with this ability to sort of channel or prophesize just as much, like his prophetic rating was also at a 100, just like Moses, but it's not just, what are the talents or skills you have, it's also how do you utilize them, and do you use them for good in the world, and, mm-hmm. and how do you do that? As the rabbis say, with great power comes great responsibility. Mm. Or that's from Spider-Man.
Yeah.
One or the other. But it's an interesting
Rabbi
point.
Spider-Man.
What?
Rabbi Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. It speaks to the prophecy piece.
Right. It also speaks to the idea, because Bilam is not, we don't know what came first and what came after in the Torah, but in terms of reading our Torah, Bilam does not come after Moshe.
Right.
Right, like there's no. So, it's interesting that it was a subsequent. Like, could it mean that after Moses' time, in which Bilam would be included into, right? That there was not another, or could it be like literally after Moshe's, Moshe himself, not just his era, but his death, which is I hadn't thought about that. And definitely was not listening when you shared that on Friday. So glad to have heard it now.
You were
I was Zoom bodying.
You were finding out that.
Yeah.
I just have to say, I was really enjoying saying Zoom bot a lot.
Which was not helpful.
Yeah. Rabbi Schatz did not find it helpful, but I was having as much fun as Rabbi Schatz was not having on Friday. That's the amount of fun that I was having.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a good assessment.
I was quite tickled by the whole situation.
Yeah. One thing that I found about the Panim piece, actually a few pieces, and I'll just kind of clump them together, but Rashi says that God was actually, that Moshe was actually familiar with God, and that he could talk to him anytime, right? And it's a really interesting relational piece, because there are certain people even within our own institution, that we know we can just walk in anytime. Rabbi Shapiro knows this better than anybody, can just walk in anytime. And there's a certain familiarity of like, no, I'm in a meeting, don't talk to me now, or, okay, sure, I have time for you. Whereas there are other people in the institution for which we would never do that, and we would always knock on their door, or we would always make sure that we set up a meeting with them beforehand or whatever.
What was that phrase you just said? Knock
on their door, yeah. We can practice it afterwards. But that, I do think that's it's not a way in which we typically think about familiarity with people, because we're not in relationship with people only through kind of the confine of an office. And when we see people out in the world in modern day, we often are inviting them to come to us or happen upon them in such a way that if it's a time and space that we can show them attention, we do. It's very rare, though in Israel, I guess it's more common to just kind of show up and be somewhere, and be received. And yet the way in which you would do that would be very different for one person than for another, depending on your relationship. And so the God Moshe piece, in terms of that familiarity, I think is such a beautiful way of thinking about God and Moshe's relationship.
Well, isn't that also presumably like what we try to do through whatever spiritual practice we engage? Like if you think about davening or whatever your spiritual practice of choice is. But then flipping that around, is it, does it mean that when the rest of us try to do that, we can't have that access because there is no one else like Moshe? Like, is it aspirational? Right? The idea of being able to talk with God whenever you want, is it that God might be listening but not talking back, or you only get that sometimes, right? It is an interesting point, because when I think about spiritual practice in whatever form, there is the hope of attaining some kind of point of contact with the divine, which, to offer up our teacher Rabbi Dorf's metaphor, right? You just because you go up to the plate, you don't hit a home run every time, right? Sometimes you strike out, sometimes you hit a single. Once in a while, you might really get there. But I think that's it. And the other thing I'll say, in terms of the talking at any time, is that I think that reads very differently in certainly a pre-telephone time, let alone a pre-iPhone time, right? That, talk to somebody anytime, I feel like, is a very different construct 3,000 years ago, right? Talk to anybody anytime, like, what's the big deal? I pick up my phone, I can call people, text people, FaceTime them. Communication, We're all in constant communication. It's not that you have a supercomputer in your pocket that you can immediately be in contact with anyone you've ever met on the planet. Right? It's very different in a, where you would have to, if it wasn't someone who you saw all that often, how would you communicate with that person?
Right.
So you could really locate them. It's very different.
Right. And interesting that when we even think back, like my grandparents always talk about how they used to have to schedule times to go to a phone, and because they knew that the operator would, like there was so much
and they
coordination,
phone, right? That was still in time when there was a phone.
Correct. But there was coordination, whereas it seems like, I think the thing for me that feels like the most intimate, I guess, is that God and Moshe didn't need any coordination. Right, like they didn't need to figure out, when are you going to come over, at what time, what are we going to be doing, right? It was much more like,
they didn't need to say, shoot me a text when you're on the way over, I'll give you the address.
Exactly. They would just show up, and it was, and I don't think it was just a they. Moshe would just show up, and God would receive Moshe in such a way that it was, and I think, not to stay on this for too long, because it's definitely not what we spent the most time on in our class, but
that's okay. That was, maybe
had I been paying attention.
Maybe if we had spent more time on this during our class, the fire alarm wouldn't have gone off.
Maybe, but
there was also a theory suggested that the reason things were going so badly on Fridays is because we're ending the class, and the universe was trying to tell us,
don't end the class.
Don't end.
But we're not really ending the class. We're just ending this class.
We're not?
The other thing I think that this brings up is like mentorship, right? That I'll just use Rabbi Kliefel as an example, because I often use him as an example. If Rabbi Kliefel is on a day off, but I need help with a sermon or with a pastoral moment, I know that is something that as a mentor, whether or not I'm working with him as the assistant rabbi of Temple Beth Am, I know that as a mentor, he's willing to have time and space for me to do that. Whereas if I call someone else for whom I might be able to get advice as well, I wouldn't necessarily even think to do that if I know that they are in a place where they're either on vacation or on a day off or just in, not available to me. So I think that's also this piece of Moshe and God of Moshe knew that God was there to kind of support and help him grow and cater to him. And so there was that element of like, my door is always open kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Even when my door is closed to everybody else, my door is always open for you. So that's just another piece. Do you want to go into the other piece of Torah that you shared that will get us to the last piece? I don't want to give anything away.
I got a whole. We don't want spoilers.
No spoilers.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
A lot of the stuff that I think the rest of it has is at the very, very, very end.
Right.
That's what
I was getting at.
That's what Rabbi Schatz is leading me to.
Yes.
So a couple of different. I'll kind of cluster them all together, and then Rabbi Schatz will close us out with great strength and might and signs and wonders.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
A lot of folks talk about how the Torah like ends and then begins again. So one teacher points out how the last letter of the Torah is a lamed, and he points out that because it is the tallest letter. Mm-hmm. Lamed is the tallest. Is that true? Lamed?
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Drawing them all out in my head as we're talking.
I don't think anything else could be taller, does it? Anyway.
It's the tallest letter.
Mm-hmm.
And he makes the point that that's because learning Torah and doing mitzvot make you live your life in an elevated way. It's an elevated way of being, which I think is a lovely drash.
Nice.
I don't know that it's pshat necessarily.
Definitely not, yeah.
But it's a lovely drash. Two rabbis, Rabbi Noah Lifshitz makes the point that the Torah ends the way it does, that Le'inei Kol that Asher Asa Moshe Le'inei Kol Yisrael Bereshit Bara Elohim, that the last verse is actually connected to the first verse, that all of the Torah is so that Israel will see that in the beginning God created, right? That there's a creator and order to the universe.
It's also how we read it. Right, like on Simchat Torah, that is how we read it. We read it as a continuation, as opposed to two steps. Like we don't wait for another week for us to read. I mean, I guess we read V'zot Habrakha this past Shabbos Mincha, and we will read Breshit next Shabbat. But we also kind of combine them on Simchat Torah to be.
I once heard have you ever heard this? I once heard that when you finish reading the Torah,
you're
supposed to like hold your breath until you start over. Have you ever heard that?
No.
Somehow I picked that up. That when it's appropriate, just when Rabbi Schatz was talking about going in and out of offices, that the inimitable Susan Emetz unlocked the door. That's the level of familiarity to see each other face to face that we have around here at the Temple Beth Am admin offices.
Indeed.
Somehow I heard that you're supposed to like go, literally from one breath, like in the same breath, to go from the end.
Interesting.
Into the
beginning. It makes sense, especially with this drosh that you're also sharing. Yeah.
Right. And then there's sort of similarly, on more of like a personal level, Reb Baruch from Mitzibuz, where I know Rabbi Schatz likes to vacation in her free time. In connecting the end to the beginning, talks about how when we look to the Torah, we renew creation each day, which is a nice idea. So lots of drashot sort of pulling together this sense of how do we end the Torah and then go into the beginning and what can we learn from that connection. The last piece I'll say to that.
Wait, can I just say something about the creation piece really quickly?
You can say whatever you like.
This past
as slowly as you like.
This past Shabbos, I was teaching a class that I've taught here before a few times, so even if you weren't at Shabbos Mincha, you've probably heard me talk about it.
I was not at Shabbos Mincha.
But you've heard me talk about it. So that Kohelet, the couplet part of Kohelet in chapter 3, is talking all about a time for living, a time for dying, a time for growing, a time for planting, a time for uprooting, all of these different things. And one of the things that I did when I was learning in Israel was connected to different pieces of Torah that take us kind of from Bereshit, from the beginning of creation, all the way through to when Joshua enters the land, similar to the point that you just made, which is when we approach the Torah, that we should be doing it in such a way that we constantly see new things in it, right? That we can, even with Kohelet, which is a thing. Which is funny because you've taught that piece before. No, I know, but when we're reading Kohelet, the idea that you take something that is all about kind of the spectrums of life, that you should be able to see within it, the stories that kind of bridge those two gaps. Rabbi Klickfeld says something very beautiful at Shabbos Mincha about how it's one side and the other side, but you don't get any of the in-between. You get planting and uprooting, but you don't get the growing. So the idea that the different stories of the Torah can kind of be the middle pieces, and to Rabbi Shapiro's point that, the element of seeing the creation story be kind of sprinkled throughout the Torah as a way of us being able to create, whether it's drashot or meaning or understanding or, kind of insert your own word there, that is a really beautiful way of just thinking about Torah in general, and something that actually I think we've done a lot of this past year in this class. So, woo! Sorry, you had a last point, and then I want to get that.
We're going to do the lev.
Oh, good, great.
But
go ahead.
But you want.
So the last piece that Rabbi Shapiro was going to share is that the last letter of the whole Torah.
There's a last piece.
The last. Oh, that's true. Yes, we have a last piece.
This is the last.
This is the penultimate.
Yes!
Yes, Rabbi Shapiro likes that word. Rabbi probably also likes that word, but...
Do you know what Rabbi Klickfeld last week used the word, what was it? He used a great word last week. I'm forgetting what it was.
Pluripotent?
No, not pluripotent. He always uses pluripotent.
So the last letter of
insouciance.
Okay. The last letter of the Torah is Lamed, and the first letter of the Torah is Bet. And together, especially if you read them actually one right after the other, together they create the word Lev, which means heart. And I shared in class on Friday that one of the things that I often think about when using those two letters to create a drash out of these two sections of Torah, bringing them together, is that there's something really important about intentionality and love and connection, especially from Moshe's leadership into the rest of our story. That without Moshe, we probably wouldn't even have the creation story written down in such a way that we were then reading Torah. So the idea that Moshe's leadership, with all the heart that he put into it and all of the really like humanity that he showed throughout his leadership, that heart piece, that lev, gets to then bring us back to another year of learning Torah.
You gotta have heart.
Miles and miles and miles of heart. Okay, we're not going to sing all of Damn Yankees, but do you want to do the last piece? That was the penultimate. This is the ultimate
ultimate Torah. That would be a good podcast.
It is actually one of my favorite pieces of Torah, so it is ultimate.
I thought you were going to say it was one of your favorite podcasts.
No.
Ultimate Torah. So also going in the other direction, that the first word of the Torah is Bereshit and the last word of the Torah is Yisrael. So this idea that the whole of the narrative of the Torah is the story of the beginning of the people of Israel, which is also like, and then you expand it out to encompass all, what happens at the beginning of the people of Israel, and then you expand it out to all.
You roll out the whole Torah.
Roll out the whole darn thing. The very last Rashi in the Torah.
Okay.
About the Torah.
Sure.
Commenting on the Torah. Rashi's last comment on the Torah.
Very good. Glad we got there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is sort of the question is begged a little bit. Asher asa Moshe le'inei kol Yisrael. What did Moses actually do before the eyes of the people of Israel? There isn't really a clear subject to that phrase or to that idea. So Rashi says this refers to the fact that his heart, inspired him to shatter the tablets before their eyes. So what was it that Moshe showed the people? He showed them how he shattered the tablets, which is an interesting thing to sort of interpolate in the last phrase of the Torah, that this is what Rashi thinks should be brought or wants to discuss.
And if you think you've heard this before, you have, because it comes up in the actual moments of Moshe coming down and shattering the tablets. This is in both the Talmud and, I don't know if it's Rashi, but it would make sense if it was, commentaries around that particular piece. This same drash, so to speak, is brought in that moment.
Right, just that Rashi says, I mean, it goes back to Avot Rabbi Natan, which is a pretty old midrashic collection on Birkei Avot, but says that God, when Moshe broke the tablet, said, Yasher Koach Asher Shibarta, like basically, good job that you broke the tablets, that it's fitting that you did this in this moment, which is, in general, an interesting idea that sometimes it is even praiseworthy to do something that seems to be not just like dramatic, but even destructive, or something that might seem to be problematic is actually necessary in order for things to continue, which I think is particularly interesting since it's the last Rashi on the Torah, that they're like this sort of lingering reminder that this is something that as you go, like people of Israel and us here today, that as you go forward to remember that sometimes, well, to Koheletize it, right, there is a time for preserving and a time for breaking, right? Sometimes you need to keep things very much as they are, and sometimes you need to sort of break them open a little bit in order for it to continue.
So we just wanted to, this was actually how we did end the class, and we just wanted to bring this is a really beautiful piece of commentary, and I would call it Torah, in terms of how we just learn in general, that sometimes we have to break things open. We have to dissect pieces of our own stories and our own understandings to really get it, to really be able to draw meaning out of it, and to be able to, the old cliche that you can't let the light in without a crack, right? That there is an element of, Rabbi Shapiro just made a real big face, the element of breaking those tablets so that they can be put back together in such a way that was meaningful for the actual people who were receiving them. And so too for us with the Parasha class, that we've been able to really dissect through a lot of Torah, some of which people knew really well, and some of which people, including us, had never looked at as deeply, and we broke it open. And that breaking open of the different verses and the different words and the different letters allows us to get to the heart of very nice, to get to the heart of the learning that we're supposed to be doing every year around the Torah. So Yasher Koach Sheshibarta, a real beautiful year of learning with everybody. We do not yet know what the next iteration of a class with Rabbi Shapiro and Rabbi Schatz will be. However, this coming Friday, we'll try to do something
What are we going to do? I don't know.
We're not sure yet. But we'll try to do something so that we are continuing this learning, because even though it might seem like it's redundant, there are elements that, as I just said, like every year it's going to be a little different, and though it might not be Parsha the same way we did Parsha this past year, the learning is always very fruitful. So we look forward to seeing you, hearing from you, learning with you, and again, Yasher Koach for being with us on this journey.
You know what's disappointing?
What?
I was really hoping a fire alarm was going to go off again. but you know what? Maybe next time. Tune in next time
for the fire alarm of Temple Beth Am.
Chag Sameach, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.